Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those who are listening in Rome and further places afield. I'm Mark Robbins, the president of the American Academy in Rome, and it's great to have you with us for our fourth conversation in our series this winter and spring. Thanks as always to the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation for their sponsorship annually of this program, which is now in its sixth year. So I'm particularly excited about the program today. It really gets to the heart of so many things we think about in terms of history and our sense of history being read through documentation, through text, and also objects and visual art. Joining us are Sheena Wagstaff, who's the Leonard Lauder Chairman of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum, and Jorge Otero-Pailos, the head of the Preservation Program at the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning and Preservation at Columbia, and an artist in his own right. I was listening to a brief interview with Sheena, and she was talking about curating in a way that seems particularly appropriate here, thinking about the sequencing of objects and images and the choices that one makes within the museum space as a way to reveal the complexity of the relationship between things, between periods, between our received wisdom of what we know about art practices and what we know about history. Preservation in Paios's hands is really a critical and a curatorial act, thinking about what gets preserved, what's saved, and what's valued. So we're excited about the dialogue today because both suggest critical readings of history, and that by making things less familiar, we see them again and understand a wider range of meanings. Our host and moderator today, who will give a more detailed introduction on our speakers, is Elizabeth Rodini, our Heiskell Arts Director at the American Academy in Rome. Elizabeth is a scholar and an educator and an art historian, as well as a curator. She seems the ideal interlocutor for today's conversation. Elizabeth's particular interest is in the afterlife of things, how objects, buildings, and historical sites are preserved, either recovered, remembered, or reinterpreted. Her 2020 book on Gentile Bellini's portrait of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II applies this line of inquiry to an iconic Renaissance portrait. Previous to joining the American Academy, Elizabeth is founding director of the program in Museums and Society at Johns Hopkins University, where, among other things, she taught courses on museum history, theory, and practice. Some of you may have seen recently Elizabeth in another brief film, this one at the Borghese Gallery, as part of their new interpretive series. And in this, Elizabeth illuminated the painter Dosso Dossi's image of Melissa. So it was kind of wonderful to see the critical history presented within that amazing space. So with that, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Rodini to the virtual podium.
Thank you, Mark. That was my site-specific work, I guess you could say. It's really a great honor to be here with our speakers tonight, who are two people I have long admired and whose work I really am excited to talk about tonight. And, you know, sitting in Rome and thinking about the title of our program, The Roots of the City, this feels especially resonant because I think we think of Rome as, you know, the eternal permanent place. And in fact, you look around and it's crumbling at every turn. So it's really exemplifying for me this paradox of what's permanent and what's not, and what lingers and what doesn't. And I think our speakers today are going to be thinking about some of those themes from a variety of angles, and thinking really about how the arts reveal and participate in this urban dialectic. So I want to get to them and try to keep these brief, but I wanted to give you a sense of who they are in case you don't know. They will each present briefly on their work and their thoughts on these topics. And after they present, we'll have a chance for some conversation between the two of them, and then some chance for questions at the end, so you can put questions in the Q&A. And we're going to start with Jorge Otero-Pailos, who's an artist and a preservationist who works in what I would call the material traces of memory. And many of his artworks are made from or through elements that he describes as deemed insignificant by others, whether this includes soundscapes or smellscapes or microscopic environmental deposits. His site-specific series, The Ethics of Dust, is an ongoing research project that has removed pollutants from structures in Venice, London, and San Francisco, and he presents this residue in monumental artistic form. He collaborates with many sorts of entities, museums, preservation institutes, civic entities, and his artwork is in collections from Belfast to Vienna, and he's shown at biennials from Venice to Chicago. And as Mark said, he is director and professor of historic preservation at the Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture in New York City. And after Jorge, we'll hear from Sheena Wagstaff, who is, as Mark said, the Leonard A. Lauder Chairman of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Metropolitan Museum. She leads this program, including the International Exhibition Initiative that was at the Met Breuer from 2016 to 2020, artist commissions and collection displays. And she's curated numerous shows, some of which I've seen and some of which sadly I missed, like Gerhard Richter, Painting After All, Like Life, Sculpture, Color in the Body, 1700 to the Present, and many others. And before joining the Met, Sheena was chief curator of the Tate Modern in London, where for 11 years she was responsible for initiating the exhibition program, the Turbine Hole artist commissions, and contributing to the conceptual framework of collection displays. I think the Turbine Hole is a great way of thinking about some of these issues of monumental structures and how we rethink them. So with those introductions, I want to turn it over to Jorge, and really looking forward to hearing from you both. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be in your company, and thank you everyone for attending. I just want to put a couple ideas on the table for us to discuss. And the first would be that the surface of art is really important. Surfaces are where we see the work, surfaces we touch, surfaces are how we understand and can connect to art. But we tend to think of those surfaces as very stable in art. You know, museums help to create this, and case and protective case around artworks that really stop their change. But works that are outside, like the one on the photograph, you can see the surface of art is really dynamic. And so I want us to think a little bit about the surface as something that's changing. If you think of the surface in this image as kind of going inward, changing inward, surfaces always also change outward. A surface has depth. And buildings, for example, you could say, where do they end? You know, the building would not exist unless it was making smoke through the boilers that come out of it. So buildings have their surfaces are not just the facades, but their surfaces extend to the inner chambers of those chimneys and to the atmosphere around them. And if you look at the history of the atmosphere of the city, and I think it's interesting that we're talking about roots of the city, because of course roots need some air to grow properly, right? But roots in Pittsburgh, for example, for 100 years didn't really grow any plants because there was no sun to be had, because there was so much soot in the air. Here's some pictures of Pittsburgh in the middle of the day. You couldn't see the sun. Now, of course, the minute that deindustrialization happened everybody started cleaning these buildings and saying, we're going to go back to the original city of Pittsburgh. But of course, there was no original city, because the original city, these buildings were built to be soiled. And so what has happened is the surface of the city is being rewritten, but it is also being erased. And, for me, my work really began as an exploration of this microscopic layer of dust that gets deposited on the surfaces of buildings. And that for me constitutes a really important layer. So I developed a technique to try to save that surface, take samples of it. And those samples became bigger and bigger over time, using latex that comes in a kind of paste, and that I apply to the surfaces of buildings. And as the latex dries, it begins to absorb all of that layer, and then allows me to then separate that layer from the surface of the building. And so here I am actually working on the Victoria and Albert Museum's largest object, which is a cast. We thought I would start with Rome, a cast of Trajan's Column. And of course, it's a copy of Trajan's Column that has been, it's in plaster, and it was put around a chimney. A chimney was built by the very people that were creating the chimneys in the 19th century for the Victorian industrial age. And so the back of this cast of Trajan's Column is in fact really never seen, but has become a kind of reverse chimney that has collected all of the dust on inside of the museum. Remember, museums were open to the outside, so they would collect all of the soot from the exterior of the city, and that was the case with the Victoria and Albert Museum. So here you see my cast of the interior of Trajan's Column, which collects the dust that was in the museum from the 1870s when this cast went up to the present. So I've done a number of these projects in different buildings around the world. This is a picture taken on the left by Ruskin in the middle of the 19th century, and you can see the Doge's Palace, how it's been cleaned since. I found the last remaining unsoiled, uncleaned wall in the Doge's Palace, which was right behind where tourists can see, and nobody would pay for the cleaning of this wall. So we cast that wall with this latex technique and made a piece for the Venice Biennial, which showed the last remaining dust on this surface. So for me, what's interesting is these surfaces, the depth of these surfaces, they have a history, they pick up meaning over time, they tell a story. And here's a mine in Spain, a silver mine that I cast because I became very interested in the way that this surface of dust is created through industrialization, of course, in our era, but there was dust in the air already in the Roman times. And this was some cast from those mines. And it turns out that dust from those mines can also be found in the ice caps. So it turns out that because the Romans tried to, in order to fuel their economy, they had to print silver. They needed silver. They produced so much pollution that they polluted the world's atmosphere. So we were not first to it. After the fall of the Roman Empire, atmospheric pollution goes down until the Spaniards discover the silver mines in Peru. And then, of course, we have the gold rush of the United States, and the production of money also becomes a major source of environmental pollution, which to me is really fascinating. So I was able to cast the two chimneys that you see here in the old US Mint in San Francisco, which was one of the last remaining buildings that survived the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And here you have some of those pieces that are at the SF MoMA now. So for me, what's interesting is these pieces pick up meaning. The dust is not the same everywhere, but the pieces are related, and they tell a story that is an environmental story, but also a political story. And I had a chance to work on a project to clean the interior of Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall is a 1,000-year-old building that is here on the right and around which, after the fire of 1832, the Barry Houses of Parliament were constructed. Here you have a kind of in-between shot of, on the lower right-hand side, of when we were cleaning those walls. You can see the difference. And I was really fascinated by, of course, the environmental pollution. And I put this for Sheena because this is, Sheena, my favorite painting in your collection. Claude Monet's Houses of Parliament. And of course, what he's interested is in the effect of the fog, you know, how that surface of the building, in fact, becomes a depth of air that makes you see the world differently, actually becomes a filter for seeing the world. So I'm very interested in the way that an artwork can become a filter through see the world, how it can obfuscate, and through obfuscation actually reveal the world itself as well in a different way, make us see the world differently. And that's what I was trying to do with this piece, which was presented in Westminster Hall, which is a cast of the wall next to it. Now, of course, Westminster Hall is a very important place, the entrance to the Houses of Parliament, the Common Chamber, but also, in a sense, the beginning of our notion of parliamentary democracy really can be traced back to here, and to the first decapitation of a king by parliamentary act. Now we do this ritualistically every 4 years, you know, in America, we decapitate the king and we elect a new one, but we really have to trace it back to this place. And this place tells, of course, a political history, but I was more interested in how that political history intermingles and imbricates itself in an environmental history. And so today, as we face climate change, for me, this is this exhibition on the day of Brexit. And so this actually completely by a coincidence, this project was commissioned and produced by Art Angel, and has since picked up meaning along the way. So I'm also interested in the way that these histories are also moving forward, picking up meaning along the way, making us think about our current relationship to the environment and our politics, you know, how our politics in a way helps us understand or negotiate that relationship to the environment. So this piece actually ended up being cut up into pieces that were disseminated to the various museums and national collections of the UK and the various nations of the UK. So there's one in Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland and so on. So it will never come back together. And it made me think of the relationship between all of these different works, which for me really begin to point to the atmosphere itself of the planet as a cultural object. And so these works that come together as the Ethics of Dust are a way of thinking about that atmosphere as a cultural object. And it's an object, of course, which we cannot see. You know, it's an object that's so large, right? And so that conceptually we cannot touch it, we cannot see it, and conceptually it's actually really hard to wrap our mind around it. But these works are a way to represent that, and the relationship between them is a way to try to get us to come to terms with that atmosphere, which, if you go back to the example of the Roman mines, contains dust in it that is thousands of years old. So if you project that history forward, the dust that we are putting in the atmosphere now will be there long before Rome is reduced to dust, and in fact could be thought of as our most important monument. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Sheena.
You're muted, Sheena.
Is that visible? It is. Good, thank you. I just have to remove. Sorry. There we go. That was brilliant. I wanted just to say thank you to Mark and to Elizabeth, particularly, and the brilliant team at the American Academy in Rome. And I just wanted to say too that the American Academy brought Jorge and I together on a blind date. And so I would like to extend my gratitude to him too for introducing his work to me, giving me greater insight into his remarkable practice in connection with the fascinating and extremely urgent topic of preservation. Speaking as a curator, the word used more often in connection with the museum is conservation rather than preservation. I'd like to discuss a little bit, maybe at the end of our in our conversation, about whether or not there is a difference between those two words. But the responsibility, of course, of the curator is to be an arbiter of cultural significance, something we take extremely seriously with a great deal of trepidation as well. And that has other implications to do with preservation, the preservation of names, of history going forward. My own career has been spent in extraordinary buildings with works by great artists who have dealt with issues of memory, social rupture, cultural trauma, geographic displacement, and the ability of materials to carry forward formal and compositional rigor without aestheticizing these notions. And so my proposal this morning are a few thoughts in response to Jorge's practice that also deal in some respects with monuments and monumental structures and what monuments actually mean with regard. They don't necessarily need to be buildings, they can be building skins, just as Jorge has pointed out. So unashamedly, I'm going to make a little advert for my mothership, the Metropolitan Museum. Many of you will have been aware of the inauguration of the Facade Niche Commissions, for which Wangechi Mutu, a wonderful artist who divides her time between Nairobi and Brooklyn, made for the Met, followed a week ago by the installation of Carol Beauvais' sculptures, very different type of stylistic idiom for the Metropolitan Museum. Both these artists dealt with the notion, which I encourage them to do, of engaging with the Metropolitan Museum, not just as an architectural entity, but also with regard to the architecture of the facade, the Beaux-Arts facade, and what that signifies in terms of when it was built and what it means nowadays, particularly in terms of Trump's edict recently about disregarding modern architecture and cleaving more to this type of architecture. But the other aspect, of course, is that they are taking on, let's say, the facade, taking on the meaning of the facade and the symbolism of the building behind it. And in Carol's idiom, of course, displacing the plinth even, and doing what she regarded as an impolite gesture towards the museum. And then moving on to the history of art, which was referred to by Mark in his introduction, what immediately came to mind when I first was aware of Jorge's work was this great, wonderful, iconic photograph by Man Ray of Duchamp's large glass, which is the accumulation of dust on the large glass over a period of a year. And we have a photograph of this in our photographs collection at the Met. A great iconic work, of course, the large glass that sort of almost single-handedly defines the history of 20th century art. But other artists moving to New York, like Eva Hesse, whose life was tragically cut very short, who worked in a similar type of way to Jorge, but also was working for entirely different ends. Her practice was really not about, I mean, she experimented with unconventional materials such as molten latex. She was very keen to use what was regarded as a casting material, but she wanted to use it directly to eliminate the molds and casts, more interested in the process and in the essential form the structural properties of rubber, where material actually defines form. Another artist following her, also interestingly female, was Heidi Booker, a Swiss artist who died in 1993. Here's an impression of a wardrobe in her grandparents' house in Winterthur in Switzerland. And what she was doing here was mummifying its surface with gauze sheets soaked in liquid rubber. She also did the same for the walls of her childhood home. And incidentally, and I was slightly alarmed to see Jorge's picture of him with his hard hat on, but no breathing equipment, because latex, certainly in the 60s and 70s, was an extremely carcinogenic material. Maybe they changed its formula by now. But what she's doing here, Booker, is she's making room skins, what she called room skins, which have an intimate psychogeography, not unlike that of Jorge. But it's not just how we inhabit spaces, but how they inhabit us, how we carry them with us, even when we have left them. And in this case, the house had been destroyed, which then moves us on to Rachel Whiteread's very iconic house, the first that she did of this kind of practice. House was on the left, the remaining house, slated for demolition and held out by one Sidney Gale, an old man who had brought up his family and generations of his family, and was eventually evicted as the last building in a plot of land that was designated as green space and a large park. And he was resettled nearby. Whiteread got permission from the local government to make a temporary structure, which was a cast of the voids of those rooms, of the spaces within that building, and which became a sort of public monument to uncelebrated normality. This is a very different kind of thing from a kind of intimate domestic way, but as Booker did, but in a memorial really for a succession of human beings. It attracted enormous public acclaim. And then it lives on in a collective consciousness because the council then demolished it. So it suffered the same fate as the structure for which it was the proxy. So it existed from October 1993 and was demolished 11 years subsequently. And then moving on to actual buildings that still exist. And as Jorge has written in his own work, the repurposing of older buildings. Here we have on the left a really great building by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott in the late 1940s, and adjoining it on the right, a new building opened in 2016 by Herzog and de Meuron. You have 3 lines of vertical windows, the third of which on the right designates the Turbine Hole inside this massive structure. It is 500 feet long, 115 feet high. For the purposes of the local council and planning purposes, it is designated actually as a street, even though it is an internal space. And it is probably the largest space for which artists are invited to make commissioned work. Here you see a very iconic image by Olafur Eliasson of the Weather Project, which, of course, for those of you who know the magic around this, you're seeing a sun, which in fact is a hemispherical false, reflected against a false mirrored ceiling. But one of the most effective commissions in my mind is this by Doris Salcedo called Shibboleth. And Shibboleth, the meaning of Shibboleth, of course, is a principle or a belief that distinguishes a group of people, especially a long-standing group of people who are regarded as no longer important. What Doris did was that she approached the building not unlike that of the way that Beauvais or Wangechi Mutu did to the Met, but she went a little further and she created this rupture through the building, an actual crack that denotes, perhaps an earthquake, and which was absolutely, it was a real assault actually on the building, because this crack did go back down into many layers of substrata and permeated the Thames barrier, the kind of plastic barrier that lies underneath the sheet, the slabs, because it's right by the Thames. And she brought with her to construct this. And it was constructed, of course, it was carefully excavated, and then the sides were fashioned in such a way to look as if each side was the mirror reflection of the other side, as if it really had literally opened up a crack in the building. She brought to London about, I don't know, a large team of Colombian studio assistants and others who lived in London and created this crack, literally with tiny instruments, even as small as dentist instruments. So it was a really provocative and very brave, I think, assault on the notion of the Western Museum, on the notion of the West generally, from a Colombian artist, which in the 2010s, you know, Colombia really has become a safer place since then, but it's still not out of the weeds, as they say. And then coming back over to New York and looking at the relationship, again, in a different kind of way, between a building and sculpture, between art and buildings. And here you see on the left, the site that was used as a result of the United Nations building, which was decided upon in the, a number of months after the end of the Second World War. In December, the US Congress unanimously, think of that, unanimous in the US Congress, decided to invite the United Nations to establish its permanent home in America. And then shortly after that, in a couple of months, they resolved that the site was going to be New York. And the architect's team for this building was literally a League of Nations. It was led by the American architect Wallace K. Harrison, but it included not just Corbusier and Niemeyer, but also architects, astonishingly, from both China and the Soviet Union, which is astonishing considering that the Cold War was on the doorstep. If you look very carefully at the right image, you can see by the fountain a sculpture which is rather dwarfed by the building. That sculpture was created by the British sculptress Barbara Hepworth, and the sculpture was commissioned by the UN and approved by Niemeyer and by Corbusier to be part of the language of this building, the language of abstraction. By the early 1950s, the language of abstraction was already established, not just in New York, but as a universal symbol for the freedom of expression and political liberty, political and social liberty. And it was deemed important to invite a sculptor who had already made large-scale sculptures. But in this particular case, it was a memorial sculpture to the memory and extraordinary work of the UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who died very tragically and rather mysteriously in an air crash in 1961. To other buildings, the Breuer building, very, very close to my heart for obvious reasons, the best building I have ever worked in my entire career, and remarkably still does not have a landmark status, but has managed to survive despite the odds so far anyway, and I hope continues to do so. And another building which did not manage to survive, a moment of real kind of trauma, I think, in New York and in the international architectural community at large, which raised huge questions about the notion of preservation and conservation, and about which actually Jorge wrote a really interesting piece in Art Forum in 2014. It had a tragically short life, this building, by Williams and Chen, and really for many months, if not a year. And this, I think the memory of this still continues in the, architects who live and work in New York, going back to Elizabeth's point about the eternal city, I think that there is a big difference between Rome and New York in that even really beautiful buildings like this can be conceived as negligible in the face of capitalism and progress. And then coming back into the Met, which is this extraordinary facade that I'm sure you will know if you've been to the Met, which echoes, of course, the facade of the Met itself, and which, talking about capitalism, is a peon and a rather extraordinary object within our collection that preserves, as it was then, the oldest building in New York at that time. It was the oldest federal building in New York. And the president of the Metropolitan Museum's Board of Trustees salvaged the facade when it was being destroyed and gave it to the museum as part of a gift to the American wing. And of course, this kind of thing I think probably couldn't happen any longer. I'm not sure whether this has a life. And then to just end my presentation, I wanted to draw your attention to some new research that has been uncovered by a unique community in New York. It is actually marked by a marker in Central Park. It was an area that extended from 81st to 89th Street between 7th and 8th Avenues. And in 1825, only 200 years ago, how quickly we all forget, there were land lots sold to individuals. And by 1950, this community called Seneca Village included 250 working class people, including Irish and German immigrant families, but in which the majority of households were African American and who owned the properties that they lived in. Very shortly afterwards, in 1856, the state legislature authorized the use of eminent domain, which was to take private property for public purposes to create a major public park, which of course echoes Rachel Whiteread, but also I think epitomizes a sort of dilemma, really, especially with the park. For those of us who have stayed in New York for throughout 2020, the park became this really major place within the city for a place of healing and sustenance during some very, very difficult times. But it was Manhattan's first prominent community of African-American property owners. So it is really crucial to understanding New York's history. And this is the view from the roof of the Metropolitan Museum, where that community would have been had it been allowed to continue. And so I'm going to end my presentation by referring back to Jorge's work, the suicide being, of course, a metaphor for the ability of humankind to kill itself, not just in terms of climate change, but in general, in the way that we allow our cities to, yes, achieve the palimpsest of history, but at the same time, there's a great deal of destruction in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Thank you, Jorge. I love the symmetry of Jorge to Jorge, different Jorge. But really, there's something so emotional about some of the things you presented. And I think is going to be a lot to say. So I'm just going to step back and see first if you have thoughts and questions for each other now that you've had this chance to hear each other's musings.
Well, maybe I can just respond to Sheena's talk very quickly. I just thank you for a great presentation and for bringing up some of my heroes, one after the other. I mean, we didn't plan this, but it was just perfect, Eva Hesse, one of the reasons why I started working with latex. Rachel Whiteread, one of the reasons why I started casting monuments. Borges, a fascination, long time fascination because of his thinking about all questions about the past, and you picked the perfect poem. And so I thought maybe I could ask you about this question of that you started with, of being an arbiter of cultural significance. You know, the position that one, you know, that you have to stand into, and that a lot of preservationists also have to, you know, inhabit, which is to think about what is important in our day and age, right? And that I think becomes even more important when you're dealing with contemporary art, because of course there is so much, and you have to select what is, you know, what to put forward. And I was interested in the way that you then moved from that to trauma and disruption. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because so much about preservation is the flip side of, I mean, it involves trauma and disruption, but also the flip side of that, which is continuity. You know, how do certain works, certain objects help us and accompany us along the way to both make sense of traumas, but help us cope with them? You know, they, in other words, they're not just representations of traumas, right? But they are also helpful in helping us take care of ourselves. They bring this question of care back to us, which is not just the care of collections or conservation, but just the care of ourselves. And so I was very interested in that. You know, I wanted to hear more about when you make the selection, or when you think about what is culturally significant, how do you negotiate between this question of works that represent trauma and works that help us cope with the disruptions that are inevitable to, you know, life? They're very different kinds of work, aren't they? I mean,
you've raised a lot of questions within your main question, and I mean, to address them as much as I can. I think that what comes to mind immediately, because I've just come off this, is with regard, I mean, first of all, I think that there are very few artists who actually deal directly with images of trauma, and when they do, they are mediated in different ways. So, you know, you have artists as various as, for instance, Gerhard Richter or Hank Willis Thomas or Walid Raad. All of them deal with very different types of cultural givens within their orbits, and cultural givens in terms of their response to what is happening currently. Richter, whose show was, you know, truncated at the Met Breuer in August of last year, had at its center these wonderful 4 paintings called the Birkenau Paintings that were based on photographs that were taken by Jewish inmates at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But they were, although I think probably intended by Richter to be figurative, in the end, he made them abstract because of the nature of those images, because of the huge risk of spectacularizing those images, and also to use painting as a metaphor for the function of memory, and both the faulty but also important role of memory, which you deal with and many other artists deal with. So, you know, does the theme of trauma come into our kind of selection criteria? No, it doesn't. I mean, we have a great advantage in that the Metropolitan Museum not only sits within a city where there is the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum, the New Museum, the Jewish Museum, there are countless, Guggenheim, you know, there are countless other museums that many of whom collect work by emerging artists. We do to a certain extent, but the sort of guiding principle for what modern and contemporary means at the Met is slightly different. It's not taking I'll say what it is rather than what it is not. It is, we have the advantage, huge advantage too, of sitting in this building, a container of all of this extraordinary, 5,000 years worth of creative endeavor by human and by humankind. And many of those objects are not and were not considered art objects. But they're artifacts that have a particular function within societies all the way back. At the same time, there's also a backbone of art within the Met, which cleaves to a European, Western, and American dedication, commitment to painting. And I think that's not really understood so much. And what we're interested in doing when we are collecting contemporary art is to diversify the notion of painting, which you are doing in many respects, but also to go into an interdisciplinary realm, which really harks back to those historic conundrum, those formal issues that artists many hundreds of years ago were dealing with in very similar ways to contemporary artists today.
It's so interesting because in a way, we are brought together by the fact that we both in some way preserve things through the things, through what we do. You preserve things, I preserve things. And we have to make conscious decisions about what is in and what is out, because our capacity is only so much, right? Mm-hmm. So I was very interested in your kind of both looking into the guts of the Met and looking out from the Met. You showed us the kind of the inner courtyard with a fabulous federal bank, which is this kind of collection of, behind that facade are all the interiors of American architecture, right? That constitute the textbook of what is American architecture. So it's a fabulous example. Right. Yeah. And then you looked out to say, what's being left out of this story that we have is Seneca Village and all of this. So I really appreciated that idea, of looking in and looking out.
I have a question for you, and you, in your presentation, you represented one of my old stamping grounds, which is Pittsburgh. And when I was working at the Frick, I inherited Henry Clay Frick's one of his desks, the bottom drawer of which was used to house a whole stack of white shirts into which he changed 3 times a day because each shirt got so filthy with the soot. And your mentioning that made me wonder about what seems to be an ambivalence on your part between both charting the effects of soot and pollution and keeping it as a kind of an upper palimpsest in the way that Carol Bove talks about modernism, in your own art. And at the same time, your first slide demonstrated quite clearly how soot is such a destructive aspect of our world today. Where do you're obviously on an ambivalent scale here, and share a little where you sit in relation to that.
Well, I mean, thank you for that. I think one of the things that has attracted me over the years to this, airborne particulate matter is the degree to which one can, and one cannot kind of fall on one side of its good or its bad very easily. The reality is that we push it out of sight because we think of it as bad. And in many ways, it's bad for our health, for sure. But the conundrum is that we haven't figured out a way to have a civilization without making the stuff. So as much as we would like to push it out of sight, and that's all we're doing, we're just pushing it around. When we clean it, we don't get rid of it. It doesn't disappear. It's a material that just gets shifted into the bottom of rivers. It gets put into dumps, but it doesn't go away. It is taken out of the visual field. So it is taken out of what is considered culture. And to me, that's the big problem, because the minute that you start thinking of pollution as not part of culture, then you have this very idealized view of culture as somehow free from all of those conundrums and problems of what it takes to make a civilization, which is, there is a flip side and a cost to it that is borne unequally by members of our society. So that bringing pollution back to culture, to me, is very important. It is an underrepresented narrative. It is an untold story, that for me is very important to tell. And that's why I brought it back to the cast courts of, for example, the Victoria and Albert Museum. This was the poor man's tour of Europe, of Western culture, right? Great monuments of Europe. Well, pollution should be one of those monuments. That was my argument. Pollution, without that pollution, we wouldn't have those monuments. And it goes all the way back to the Roman period. To me, dealing with that complexity is part of art. Dealing with that both and is part of art. And this is for me also why, over the course of the years, I've learned a lot. I learned from each of these works, by the way. I don't start with work knowing what I'm going to end up doing. I started something along the way happens. But I've learned a lot about ethics. This is called the ethics of dust. I started with that. And typically, what I've learned is that ethics today is not a search for a cause or an origin, right? Like if you look at Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, it's like that begins the problem, right? We used to think that ethics comes from God, tells us right and wrong, and Nietzsche says God is dead. So what do we do now, right? Everything is devalued. Well, then comes Foucault, which I found very, very helpful, and says it's not about finding a source or a cause or an origin. It's about figuring out the way that this idea of right and wrong creates a society and a set of social relations in which power is articulated. And that for me is why it was so important to put this work in the Houses of Parliament, because that's where power is really organized and policy written that makes decisions about who bears the cost of pollution and so on. So it's for me, not so much, I guess, to circle back to your question, not so much an ambivalence, but I think the question needs to be posed in such a way that we can talk about it, without starting off with a position that these folks are wrong and these folks are right. Pollution is wrong, pollution is right. Who made it? Who's at fault over here? But we're all making the stuff. We can't live without it. We can't live without pollution. That's why I think of it as our greatest unintentional monument. And because it's unintentional, we don't consider it art, because so much about everything that we talk about as art is, the signature of the artist, the provenance and so on. I mean,
you're raising the word ethics and referencing Foucault and Nietzsche takes us into another, this is going to have another whole session. Sorry, American Academy, we'll have to do that. But I think that, to your point about taking the work to the Houses of Parliament, and you're very, in doing that, in making that gesture, you are also establishing the need for power to power in a way. You are you're creating a spectacle that has to be taken account of. My question to you, and I know that we're coming close to time, but is, do you worry sometimes that the beauty of your work, which was so evident in your slides, might come very close to aestheticizing that issue and therefore robbing it or maybe diminishing the effect of its power in that kind of context?
No, I think it's the opposite. You know, I think that it's important for it to have an aesthetic dimension, and this is important because it is an access point. I think these works need to, for me, it's important that they have multiple access points, entry points, and multiple exit points, because they're not lessons, they're not dogmatic, you know, they're not prescriptive. There's no injunction in my work that you should behave one way or another. So I think it's very important that somebody that knows nothing about what I'm doing might find enough in the work aesthetically for their attention to be sustained, and in sustaining their attention, begin to ask, what is this thing? What is it doing here? You know, why is it covering up half the building? What is this about? And so those questions are the kinds of questions that are important to me. I don't think aesthetics is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, you know, that not a good thing, but it's a necessary part of the work that we do, and the way that we communicate visually. I think that, and this is part of the problem with preservation as well, is that it has this question of judgment that we talk about, you know, who is the arbiter of cultural significance? That arbitration happens on the side of the brain that is very verbal. And it has become a kind of judgment, you know, literally in the sense of, you know, passing judgment, but it, you know, it's a sentence, it's a sentencing act, right? I'm passing judgment, and but also putting a string of words together. That's a different way of seeing the world than the emotional side of the brain. And the emotional side of the brain that deals with memory is what I'm that's let's say the world that I'm working with through my art. And it also is a way of getting to certain kinds of judgments, but aesthetics is a necessary part of it. And I know that with Debord and, you know, the side of the spectacle, anything that was vaguely interested in beauty was considered suspect of being complicit with the worst kind of power. But I don't, you know, I don't find that very useful. And I think that it's important for us to this is public art, you know, it has to really engage the public at all levels. So for me, the aesthetics is important. And you know, what I found really interesting though about that work is that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson used it to hide from journalists behind the curtain. That I thought was, they were taking phone calls behind it, because, right. And that, to me, that is the interesting, the use that people make of it is what I'm really drawn to it. And this again is the subject for another conversation, but I'm very interested in the way that people behave around art. Yeah. The fact that the best use that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson could make of my work was to hide behind it, was to me, you know, like the epitome of the, you know, so telling. But I look
speaks to the multiplicity.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Yeah. You've hit on so many, I mean, from aesthetics to memory to you know, politics and power and history. We could continue for a long time. And I thought of there's a really wonderful Italian word, incuriosare, to make curious. And I think what you've done, Jorge, your work makes people curious. And Sheena, you've shown how much through your curating, you're bringing in this way of investigating the world that really poses so many questions. So I'm really grateful to both of you. And I thank our audience. There were some questions, but I felt we needed to hear what you had to say to each other. So my great thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jorge and Sheena. It was remarkable to see the intersections to think about this idea of removals, what's visible, what's invisible, and the connection to ethics in who makes decisions about value. I think these are common in the discussions through artistic work and also scholarship, this relationship between text and image, and not smoothing out the difference, not making it a straight, easily received historic line, but actually doing what you do through your work to draw attention to difficulty. And Sheena, what you do as a curator is to introduce roadblocks to easy access or easy narratives. So thank you so much. And thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to the audience. I know it's frustrating, but I'd love to give it a round of applause to our group, even in exile, in spatial exile. So thank you so much. I look forward to continuing these discussions. Our next conversation is April 13th with Pamela Long and Nicola Camerlenghi, and that's looking at the urban form of Rome from medieval to early modern times. And that's going to be in Rome, 6 p.m. Rome time, where Elizabeth is now, and noon Eastern Standard Time. And then Friday, April 22nd, please join us for the Rome Prize ceremony. And we'll have as keynote speakers our own wonderful director of Inwam Shalem, speaking with architect David Atje, and looking at space and the intersection of faith and space. So a good lead in for our next year's theme of ethics. Thank you so much. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Ciao.
Thanks so much.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Good night. Thank you.